Desert Immigrants by Mario T. Garcia, Chapter 7, The Barrios. Unlike job relationships, where some contact between Mexicans and Americans occurred, living arrangements were characterized by almost total racial separation. While no legal restrictions prohibited Mexicans from living in the better homes found in American neighborhoods, although most Mexicans preferred to live among another because of racial and cultural affinity, occupational and wage discrimination, in addition to racial and cultural prejudice, kept them tied to the Mexican slums where the worst housing existed. Mexicans lived in overcrowded homes with little or no sanitation, high infant mortality rates, many cases of tuberculosis and other diseases, and the highest crime rate in the city. These conditions posed many problems, but Mexicans adjusted because they knew poverty and because they hoped they would reside only temporarily in El Paso. Unfortunately, their adjustment left them vulnerable to exploitation, not only in housing, but in other activities as well. The large-scale employment of Mexicans as unskilled labor, plus intensive Mexican immigration, determined the location of the barrios in El Paso. The proximity of the city, for example, to the United States-Mexican border, made Chihuahua, as the Mexicans called the Central Barrio, in the southern half of the city, the principal and initial settlement for immigrants. Moreover, the location of industries and businesses that found it profitable to hire Mexican labor also influenced where Mexicans lived. Chihuahua represented a labor pool where the nearby railroads, construction firms, downtown retail and wholesale stores, laundries, and other employers, as well as American housewives, found needed workers outside of Chihuahua. Mexicans resided in two other major areas: the smelter community of the American smelting and refining. I hate it when it does this. Here is the map. And this is the map of the area. Company, one such settlement outside the western limits of El Paso and along the Rio Grande River in the in the southeastern part of the city. East El Paso, Mexicans found work in the adjacent yards of such railroads as the El Paso and Southwestern and Galveston, Houston, and San Antonio line. In addition to the El Paso foundry in the area hired a number of Mexicans. These three locations south of the tracks and along the river border became the most densely populated sections of the city between 1880 and 1920 and beyond, and the centers of Mexican daily life. Besides the valley, agricultural communities of Isleta and San Elizario, east of El Paso, Mexicans in the city had traditionally resided along the Rio Grande. No pueblo, however, had ever existed in this area because the main Mexican settlement had always been in El Paso del Norte, Ciudad Juarez, on the Mexican side of the river. By the 1890s, as more Mexicans migrated to the border, this section north of the frontier, which came to be called Chihuahua, also expanded in 1900. Chihuahua covered almost all the second ward, El Segundo Barrio, whose boundaries included the land south of the Texas and Pacific Railroad tracks, bounded on the west by the Santa Fe Yards and on the east by the riverbed. Part of the barrio, known as El Chimizo, however, represented disputed territory between the United States and Mexico due to a sudden change in the Rio Grande Channel. In 1852, about 600 acres of Mexican property had become located north of the new channel. Nevertheless, El Paso exercised jurisdiction in this part of Chihuahua until both countries finally settled the issue in 1963. The 1900 manuscript census reveals the early concentration of Mexicans in South El Paso. The great majority of Mexican workers and small merchants lived there either in District 19, in the southwestern half of the city by the Santa Fe Yards, or in District 20, which covered most of Chihuahua. The second ward and part of the central city, as a result, the southern extensions of such streets as South El Paso, South Oregon, and South Stanton, in addition to the cross streets from 2nd to 10th, contained predominantly Spanish surnames. The rest of the census districts possessed few Mexicans. District 21, for example, which included streets in Central and East El Paso, such as San Antonio, Olive, and McGoffin, had 266 families, of which only 39 gave Spanish surnames. Some of them lived as, as servants in American homes. While most Americans in the district were professionals or craftsmen, the Mexicans worked as manual laborers or domestics. In District 22, which covered the north central and northeastern portions of the city, with such streets as San Antonio, San Francisco, and Mesa, the census numbered 391 families, 49 of which had Spanish surnames and lived mainly at the city limits near the GH and SA tracts. While the Mexicans in this area were laborers, the Americans held professional or craft occupations. District 23 included the north side of El Paso and streets such as Mesa, California, and Franklin, and counted 419 families, but only 11 with Spanish surnames, who lived on either Main or Franklin Street. The Mexican male heads of households apparently worked as railroad laborers. On the other hand, most Americans listed had jobs as skilled railroad employees. Finally, District 24 included the northwestern section of the city. 413 families lived there, of which 176 had Spanish surnames. Yet of this number, 167 had homes in the so-called Mexican settlement on the San Francisco street. While American skilled workers, merchants, and professionals resided in the area, the Mexicans worked as laborers of 219 occupations listed for the Spanish surnamed males over 18 on San Francisco Street. 166 were laborers, revealing the relationship between Mexican residential patterns and immigration. Most Mexicans listed in the 1900 census had recently arrived in the United States. Approximately 86% of the Spanish surnamed households units in the 1900 sample were foreign-born. 2 years after the completion of the 1900 census, the city directly reported that 60% of the Mexican population lived south of Overland Street, which together with San Antonio and 2nd Streets, plus the railroad tracks, formed the northern barriers between Gringo, El Paso, and Chihuahua. During the next 20 years, the rigidity of this boundary forced the Mexican district to grow in an eastward direction, but still south of the tracks and along the border. Evidence of this expansion can be seen in the location of Catholic churches and public schools, which served the Mexican population. Dedicated on June 9th, 1893, Sacred Heart Church on South Oregon between 4th and 5th Streets administered to the center of Chihuahua. Major floods in the area 4 years later and new immigration led to an easterly movement of Mexicans to the area of 2nd and Park Streets, where by 1904 St. Ignatius Church history. Assisted close to 150 Mexican families as the parish extended from 2nd Street to the river. By 1908, the flow of Mexicans had continued to the east and reached the suburbs of the Cotton Bassett and East El Paso additions, where the El Paso diocese established Guardian Church, Angel Church, for the Mexicans of the district. Within the borders of these three parishes lived the largest number of Mexicans in El Paso. The development of de facto segregated public schools for the Mexicans also reflected an easterly movement. Built in 1899 at 7th and Kansas, Oye School in the center of Chihuahua was the first Mexican school. 7 years later, attorney Adolph Huffman, who completed a school census of the city, reported to the school board that South El Paso had been almost totally filled with Mexicans and that not more than 20 American families remained south of 3rd Street. Consequently, the Alamo School at Hill and 4th in the eastern section of Chihuahua had become a Mexican school. Moreover, Huffman pointed out that many Mexican families had settled in the neighborhood of the Franklin School on West Overland and in West Overland in the southwestern extremities of the city. The school superintendent in 1908 further noted the rapid growth of the Mexican population. At the Oye School, 837 Mexicans constituted the entire school population. The Franklin School contained 100 Mexicans out of a total enrollment of 163 students. Of 517 pupils, the Alamo listed 500 Mexicans. The superintendent likewise observed that the Beale School in East El Paso taught 300 Mexicans in a total enrollment of 324. Although the American families in these neighborhoods protested at times to the school board about Mexican encroachment, most Anglos by 1910 had left these districts and moved to the north and northeastern areas of El Paso. In addition to Chihuahua and the southeastern suburbs, which contain the majority of the Mexican population, other smaller Mexican settlements developed in El Paso. For example, beginning in the 1890s, many smelter workers rented houses near the smelter. In 1897, the Spanish-language newspaper El Monitor observed that town, as the smelter settlement was called, had grown rapidly and that the Mexican colonia had about 2,000 inhabitants. 2 years later, St. Rosalia's Catholic Church, later renamed San Jose del Rio, opened for the Mexican workers and their families at the smelter. Although the construction of a smelter line by the streetcar company in 1902 made it possible for some workers to live in Chihuahua and commute to the smelter, many Mexicans chose to remain in town. It has been estimated that in 1923, about 5,000 Mexicans and a few Americans resided in the settlement. 2 other pockets of Mexicans could be found in El Paso during this time. Owing to severe flooding of the Rio Grande River in 1897, some Mexicans left Chihuahua and squatted on Kearns Place. In the sparsely populated northern foothills of the city, here they paid squatters' rent to D. Storms, the owner of the property, which consequently was called Stormsville. Besides their homes, the Mexicans erected a chapel, Nuestra Senora de la Luz. Charles Armijo, who arrived in El Paso from Chihuahua in 1910, recalls that about 500 Mexicans lived in Stormsville. Some worked for the city garbage company. Armijo noted wherever they could find work, unquote. The Mexicans remained in the area until 1928, when the city condemned their homes for sanitary reasons and relocated them in Southside. At their departure, Stormsville consisted of 5 blocks of houses with 75 families and almost 400 persons. One historian has written that the Mexicans had built their homes of adobe except for the church, and that the settlement contained no sewers and only 4 toilets. After their removal, a newly organized railroad company purchased the land, and the purchase marked the beginning of what came to be the residential showplace of El Paso. It has been said, and not correctly so, that no plot of ground in the Southwest has known such extremes. In people, culture, worldly goods, architecture, etc., has rimroad El Paso. The last Mexican settlement took place in Sunset Heights in the northwest section of El Paso, one of the older and more elegant neighborhoods with enough money to purchase or rent homes. Several wealthy Mexican families had fled the Mexican Revolution, settled in the area after 1910. Quote, They bought property in Sunset Heights, remembers old-time residents Enrique El Acevedo, and many rich people, some millionaires, from Torreon, Guadalajara, and Chihuahua, came to live in the area for many years. Although many returned, Mario Acevedo, who arrived in El Paso in 1916, recalls that prominent Mexican physicians such as Domitio Arguelles, Domitio Rodarte, Don Edmundo Arguelles, and Andreas Villarreal settled in Sunset Heights. Some of their descendants continued to live in the area around Porfirio Diaz Park and Upson on Monday streets. To care for the spiritual needs of these political refugees, Holy Family Church on West Missouri opened in 1914. The Americans of Sunset Heights apparently tolerated their New Mexican neighbors because of their small numbers and because they were a more cultured group than the working-class Mexicans of the South Side. Nevertheless, as more Mexicans moved into the district after 1920, many Americans left. Although Mexicans spread to the southwest of Chihuahua, but more importantly to the southeast, evidence of individual geographic mobility could not be obtained. A sample of Spanish surnames from the 1900, 1909, and 1915 city directories proved inconclusive due to the inability to trace most individuals. While the lack of information may reflect flaws in the directories, it could also indicate frequent changes of address by the Mexicans or their short stay in El Paso. However, a sample of Spanish surnamed males from the 2 El Paso draft boards during World War I reveals that most Mexicans continued to live in the area of Chihuahua and the southeastern suburbs out of a total sample of 274 Spanish surnamed persons. 66% resided in South El Paso, while 25% lived primarily in the southeastern suburbs of the Cotton, Bassett, and East El Paso additions, although a few did list homes in the northern half of the city. In addition, the draft cards did not contain addresses for 8% of the sample. The residential division between Mexicans and Americans can also be seen from a draft board sample of 304 persons. With non-Spanish surnames, only 33 had homes in South El Paso, of which 17 were blacks. The rest, with non-Spanish surnames, resided in the Central District, Sunset Heights, the northern parts of the Cotton and Bassett additions, or in the new northeastern suburbs of Franklin Heights, Golden Hill Addition, Alexandra Addition, and Highland Park. Moreover, by 1920, Anglo families had spread farther north and east to include still other suburbs such as Manhattan Heights, Altura Park Addition to and Government Hill Addition. Although Mexicans worked in many of these new neighborhoods as laborers for the construction firms, they could not afford to live there. In some cases, real estate companies refused to rent to those few Mexicans who appeared to have the money for one of the new apartments built after 1910 in the American sections. One advertisement in the Herald in 1916 read, "3-room modern apartment, Americans only," unquote. Despite the growth of the Mexican settlement by 1920, geographic mobility resulted only in the enlargement and perpetuation of barrios. Furthermore, Chihuahua continued to serve as the major settlement for recent immigrants and consequently contained the largest number of Mexicans. Some of the older residents of the area apparently moved to the eastern sections of the Second Ward or to the southeastern suburbs. However, newly arrived immigrants quickly replaced them. In addition, the suburbs and the smelter settlement had both old and new immigrants attracted by the availability of jobs in these locations. The combination of large-scale Mexican immigration and economic underdevelopment effectively segregated Mexicans and produced one of the worst housing, health, and crime conditions in the city. In 1900, Louis Gilbert of Missouri, on a visit to El Paso, described to the Vicksburg Dispatch one of the first sights a stranger saw in the border city. As he glides into the city over the Texas Pacific Railway, in its free palatial reclining chairs, his vision encounters numerous huts built of adobe, a species of mud made into slabs of about 12 by 8 inches from 2 to 3 in thickness, laid on in rows with mortar used as a cement and built to a height of about 12 feet, in some instances much lower. Gilbert reported that these huts contained from 1 to 3 rooms and were the homes of Mexicans who, to remain and work in the United States, must reside within its border, hence the great Mexican and Indian population of El Paso. In sharp contrast to the dirt houses, the Missourians noted the better homes and businesses of Americans. These included numerous public and office buildings, apartment houses, schools, churches, and banks. Despite horrible sidewalks, Gilbert observed that Americans build their houses of bricks, unlike adobe homes of the Mexicans. Few sanitation facilities existed in Chihuahua, and the other barrios, where the jackals, as the Mexican adobe homes were called, jackals, were built of mud with dirt floors. Mexicans used the Rio Grande River for bathing as well as recreation, although for many, this marked no departure from the previous practice. Many Americans expressed distaste for the immorality of the Mexicans. The Times observed in 1892 that several Mexican boys had been arrested for nude bathing in the Rio Grande and indecently exposing themselves. Yet, without sufficient water pumps in Chihuahua, these early Mexican families had little choice but to use the river. At times, this led to tragedy. In 1903, 22-year-old Gilberto Terrazas drowned in the river, and according to the Times, he was one of many who died while bathing or swimming. Terrazas had been a hard-working young man, the paper eulogized, and had been employed by some of the local contractors. To prevent other such accidents, a chief of police in the summer of 1905 prohibited swimming, bathing, or washing in the river between sunrise and sunset, and also indecent exposure of person. Those violating this order would be subject to a fine not to exceed $100. With the chief F.J. Hall hoped would reduce the number of drownings from 37 in 1903 and 17 in 1904. Yet 3 days later, the Times reported that apparently the Mexicans had not understood the prohibition as large numbers continued to use the river. Hearing of the violations, police officials dispatched an officer to the southern portion of the city with orders to arrest any bathers. When the officer arrived at the river, the reporter noted he found a great crowd of men, women, and children disporting themselves in the water in various stages of undress, and ranging from a Mother Hubbard in the case of women and a pair of trousers in the case of men to absolute nudity. 3 women and 3 small boys were arrested and escorted to the city jail. Unable to prevent Mexicans from using the river and faced with major health problems that might affect American neighborhoods, the city council 1 week later discussed the construction of sewer connections in Chihuahua. One obstacle of this plan, however, was who would be taxed for the improvement. The city physician reported that although some progress had been made in sanitary conditions by installation of water connections, the majority of Mexicans did not have the money to pay for additional sanitation. Mayor Charles Davis agreed and stated that the property owners, mostly Americans who rented to the Mexicans, should be forced to pay. The mayor further urged that the matter be settled as quickly as possible for both the health of the city and that of Southside residents depended on it. Yet real estate dealer H.R. Wood argued that landowners in Chihuahua could not contribute to these facilities. Wood claimed that the 50 cent per month rent paid by Mexicans for the use of the land on which they constructed their jaquils did not produce any profit. Consequently, Wood believed that the Mexican owners of the houses, not the property owners, should be made to pay. An alderman agreed and emphasized that land in Chihuahua did bring a profit. He pointed out that in many cases 6 or more houses could be found on a single lot, which greatly increased rent revenues. Property in the area was a good investment, the alderman remarked, and paid 18%. Despite the disclosure, the city council compromised and ordered the health department to install as many water connections as possible on each lot, and both owners and tenants to pay for the work. Besides the lack of an adequate water system, residents of South El Paso had no heating facilities during cold weather. Instead, they gathered firewood from the timber that flowed down the Rio Grande. As in the case of bathing and sanitation, the Mexicans' adaptability sprang from their rural and small town background and from the force of the circumstances beyond their control. Nevertheless, some of the more educated Mexican American leaders appeared before the city council in 1910 to protest the unsanitary nature of the Chihuahua neighborhood. These people may be poor, Dr. J.A. Samanigo appealed to the council, but they are human beings entitled to human treatment. And you gentlemen will agree with me that it is not right that the alleys around their homes should be made a dumping ground for the trash and filth gathered from the streets of the city. Samanigo further declared that he had inspected conditions in Chihuahua that would shame the spectated conditions. Oh, I'm so sorry. Shame the holes. Oh, that he had inspected conditions in Chihuahua that would shame the holes of Calcutta. That's right. Sorry, got lost. Calling for an investigation, he informed council members that the death rate in the area had reached an appalling level. Businessman Felix Martinez joined the Mexican physician in protest, but also blamed the Mexicans themselves. Martinez alleged that the residents of Chihuahua would let a dead dog lie in the alleys or streets until it rotted, and that they would walk around a deposit of human filth on the sidewalk a month and never report it. Martinez concluded that authorities should force the Mexicans to obey the city's health regulations. Defensively, the mayor of El Paso stated that the city possessed the finest health department in Texas, and other council members insinuated that the Mexicans' living habits created the health hazard. One alderman observed that the council had passed an ordinance prohibiting dirt floors, but that it had been unenforceable in South El Paso because Mexicans refused to report violations. He stressed that if the residents of Chihuahua desired better sanitation, they should phone in their complaints like the Americans on the north side. How the Mexicans possessing few phones could do this did not seem to concern the alderman. Ending its session, the council referred the entire matter to a committee for immediate action. Although some improvements did occur in the barrios, officials took a much longer time than in American neighborhoods before they acted. Even then, the changes often proved inadequate. For example, few sidewalks were constructed in South El Paso throughout most of the period, and those that existed could not be used when it rained. The streets of Chihuahua also remained unpaved for some time. In 1895, 25 residents of the South Side, including 14 Mexicans, petitioned the city council to fill up stagnant pools of water on certain streets. 2 years later, El Monitor complained about the poor condition of the streets where rubble and latrines could be found. Although none of El Paso's streets or sidewalks had been paved during the 1890s, by 1906 all had been paved north of Oregon Street in the American sections. Yet in the South Side, only El Paso Street had been filled by 1907. After 1910, the city finally completed the pavement of major streets and sidewalks in Chihuahua. Because of its location by the railroad tracks, the Mexican district became a dangerous area for residents, especially children and older people. In 1902, Mrs. Regino Martinez filed a $13,750 suit against the El Paso and Northeastern Railroad for injuries to her 12-year-old son, who had been run over by the train and lost both his hands. According to Mrs. Martinez, the locomotive gave no warning as it crossed near the Stanton Street intersection where it hit her son. The same year, a Sierra Madre car ran over and killed a 15-year-old Mexican boy at the Santa Fe street crossing. 3 years later, the Times reported that a 65-year-old Mexican woman had been hurt by one of the streetcars passing through Chihuahua. The lack of playgrounds and parks for the Mexican children who played instead on streets and railroad tracks contributed to the accident rate. In 1909, while flying a kite on South Stanton Street, 11-year-old Refugio Armenta ran into an outgoing train that instantly killed him. Neighbors stated that prior to the accident, Refugio and 5 other Mexican companies had used the street and tracks as a playground for several weeks and had narrowly avoided accidents. While the residents of the area awaited the arrival of the police, the Times reporter observed, meantime, scenes probably as heart-rending as any that have ever been enacted drew a morbid crowd. 300 or 400 persons gathered around. When the little fellow's mother was notified, she became frantic with grief. Friends took her to her home at 1220 South Stanton, while the little lad's father, shaken with sobs, knelt heartbroken beside the crushed form of his little boy. Floods and freezing weather posed the most crucial and disastrous threats for Mexicans. Not only did they have inadequate protection against these natural hazards, but they often lost what few possessions they had as a result. This proved especially true prior to 1910, when paved streets turned into virtual rivers and lakes. When it rained, one of the first major floods occurred in May 1891, when the north embankment of the canal that ran through the Chihuahua gave way and flooded a number of jackals. Throughout the night, the residents had to transport their belongings to safer places. On all sides could be heard the falling of houses. The Times reported, intermingled with the occasional yelp of a poor canine who, in the hurry of moving, had been forgotten by the owner. Some Mexicans found shelter with friends or relatives, while others pitched tents on elevated ground until the flood subsided. Unfortunately, heavy July rains in 1897 led to more severe flood than usual in Chihuahua. Excuse me. Many residents lost their homes and fled to safer areas such as Stormsville. A monitor pointed out that Chihuahua had been the only place where the city officials permitted poor Mexicans to build their houses, despite the fact that it was the lowest section of the city and susceptible to floods. Other floods that washed away adobe homes took place in 1903 and 1905. Although cold weather did not destroy Mexican shacks, it did bring much suffering. Those who found coal or firewood to warm themselves faced the danger of having fires burn down their jacals. In some cases, lack of fuel forced Mexicans to steal coal from railroad cars stationed in Chihuahua. Perhaps the worst devastation due to cold weather occurred in January 1906. On January 11, the police assisted 56 Mexican families with about 300 persons suffering from cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Police Captain Greet and officers DeGaldo and Franco also discovered huts and hovels where families of from 3 to 18 were existing in a condition of squalor and misery indescribable. To help them, the city and county began a relief program and appointed the police to go into Chihuahua and find those in need. According to the newspaper, they distributed wagons of food and provisions. In one instance, the Times reported a family of 18 persons consisting of the father, mother, their 9 children, grandmother, and father, and 5 relatives was found huddled in a adobe house just south of the canal in the rear of Santa Fe Street. All were seated around in the room on the dirt floor, hugging themselves up in their tattered apparel in an effort to keep from freezing to death. There was no fire in the little fireplace, and in a box that served as a cupboard were a few but empty dishes. In other jackals, the police found widowed mothers with young children in total destitution. Besides snow turning dirt floors into mud puddles, most huts contained no stoves, forcing residents to cook at a fireplace. Where the latter are missing, a reporter observed large tin cans serve the double purpose of heating the house and cooking. The reporter also noted that the cold weather kept the men from their work and did not allow the women to do their washing. In 2 days, officials, in conjunctions with private charities and some businessmen, took care of more than 100 families, which included about 500 cold and hungry persons. Living conditions in Chihuahua further deteriorated by 1910, as large numbers of Mexican immigrants and refugees from the Mexican Revolution arrived. Fearing that such a concentration of people might cause epidemics, some city officials campaigned to, quote, clean up the Mexican settlements. During July of that year, the health department conducted a sanitary inspection from the old military base at Fort Bliss in the western section of the city to Washington Park in the east, and from 2nd Street to the river. The department examined 1,194 houses and found 563 to be dirty and unsanitary. In addition, 693 had no sewers and 526 had become inhabitable. You can see from this report, Dr. Anderson, the head of the department, what a deplorable condition exists when almost 1/2 of these houses are marked uninhabitable, taking into consideration that there are 5 persons to each house, and usually more. You have 2,530 persons living in houses not fit for animals. Anderson pointed out that in most cases, Mexicans rented the land on which they built their homes. Although at times the landowners erected the shacks, its report completed, the health department recommended to the city council that it destroy many of the adobe houses. In September, Dr. Anderson also informed the council that George Look, who owned houses in the Chihuahua, had agreed to cooperate in destroying 1,500 condemned homes. When asked how long it would take to accomplish, Look replied that it would be done as soon as tenants could be removed, and he requested the city to use the police to do this. A number of the residents appeared at the council meeting and agreed to vacate their homes when told they had 30 days to do so. Where these homeless Mexicans went cannot be determined, but they probably moved in with other families, exasperating overcrowded conditions in South El Paso. During the next few years, the health department continued to investigate and condemn numerous other Mexican homes in Chihuahua. In the process, it discovered that most of the land, as well as some of the jackals, was owned by Americans. The department's September report in 1913, for example, disclosed unsanitary conditions in a number of small buildings with 115 rooms on South Oregon Street and the Juarez Alley. Mexicans occupied all these residences, but ownership belonged to either the El Paso Southern Railway or TB Dockery. Although Mexican immigrants owned property in El Paso in the form of their jaquils, it did not have much value, as city tax records reveal. Besides the destruction of the Mexican shacks, an early day urban renewal project by 1916, municipal officials began encouraging the construction of tenement houses. As part of the effort, the city graded more of the streets on the south side and installed an improved storm and sanitary sewer system. As a result, property owners started building the tenements the city desired, which, according to the Herald, also proved to be a profitable undertaking. The newspaper related that many investors had already received handsome returns from their construction of cheap and two-story tenements. There is little doubt, the Herald predicted, that the old houses now being torn down will give place to tenements. While many shacks remained, contractors built several tenements in 1916 in Chihuahua and East El Paso. These tenements were an improvement over the jackals, but they too soon became overcrowded and unsanitary, owing to the Mexicans' poverty, continued immigration, and neglect by landlords. Some observers, however, subjectively blamed depressed tenement conditions throughout the Southwest on the low living standards of the Mexicans, having few standards to begin with. Vera L. Sturgis wrote in the survey in 1921, it is not surprising that the poor Mexican immigrant is content in the tenements with one toilet and one hydrant for 15 families, 4 and 5 of these families living in 1 or 2 rooms. El Paso historian Cleophas Caloreus remembered that 2 rooms in the early tenements could be rented for $3 a month, and some of those are still in existence. Caloreus noted in a 1972 interview, of those are still in existence. Caloreus noted in a 1972 interview, I'm sorry. Shit. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that. And in some 1972 interview, the only improvement, sorry guys, the only improvement they have made is to raise the rent from $3 to $25.50 or $30 for 2 rooms. Marico Cordero, who arrived as a young man during the Mexican Revolution, recalls that he first lived in a tenement at the corner of 4th and Tellus, in front of the Alamo School. According to Cordero, tenement residents paid $4 a month for 2 rooms. Moreover, Southside housing after 1920 failed to improve. A 1925 report by the El Paso City Plan Commission stressed the need to proceed with the sanitation of the Chihuahua and have a thorough cleaning up in the sections where human habitations are congested. And in 1934, a city council survey of Chihuahua pointed out that the conditions had become worse. There are 9,500 families living in the area marked slums. It stated in substandard housing. Although many Mexicans in El Paso moved to other barrios, in later years, Chihuahua, which had begun as Mexican slums, survived as highly congested one. Because of the unsanitary conditions in the Mexican settlements, a higher rate of sickness and disease there existed there than anywhere else in El Paso. As early as 1883, the Lone Star noted that it had received warnings about the Mexican jackals as possible breeders of disease. Whether this is true of these places or not, we are not in possession of sufficient information to say. The newspaper stated, but they are certainly very filthy and unsightly, and might, in the event of an epidemic, become the harbor of disease and death. In 1892, cases of diphtheria were reported in South El Paso, and health officials warned Americans to be careful in their contacts with the Mexican population. There is no diphtheria in the city at present, one official announced, but it has prevailed in the Mexican towns on this border for several years, and persons who take children to the circus should bear this factor in mind and keep them away from Mexican children. Cleophas Caleros remembered that around 1904, when a diphtheria epidemic hit the city, health officials deported many Mexicans across the border to Ciudad Juarez, regardless of citizenship. Caleros' own brother and two sisters died in 1 week, and I was the only one of the family left. The outbreak of smallpox among the immigrants had also led to a quarantine against Juarez a few years earlier that deprived many Americans of one of their border diversions. Because occasional cases of smallpox remained, E. Alexander, the United States Sanitary Inspector, had requested that Americans not attend on the Sunday bullfights in the Mexican town. Those who failed to obey his request, Alexander had warned, would be held in violation of the American quarantine regulations. Although El Paso claimed that its sunny and dry climate made it a perfect site for the care of tuberculosis, the disease became widespread among the Mexicans. Besides discovering that 15,000 people went hungry in El Paso in 1909, Conference of Charity Workers announced that large numbers of tuberculosis cases had been found in the Mexican districts. According to medical officials, the problem had not existed in the city prior to large-scale Mexican immigration, and they cited one case where 12 members of a Mexican family died within a year due to tuberculosis. Charity official Mrs. E. Kohlberg believed that the disease could be blamed on the city sanitation department, which swept the streets of Chihuahua without first sprinkling them with water, thus scattering dust in every direction and releasing millions of germs. The conference further heard from Mr. F. H. McLean, the field secretary of the Russell Sage Foundation, who had arrived to investigate health conditions along the border. McLean stated that unlike other cities in the country, El Paso faced a unique situation because of its location, which gave rise to a severe immigration problem. This could be seen, he reported, in the death rate from tuberculosis. In addition, McLean commented that the infant mortality rate in El Paso had increased substantially. Many Mexican babies died between the ages of 4 months and 2 years. McLean concluded that tuberculosis among Mexicans originated from their unsanitary adobe houses, which lacked fresh air and sunshine, and where too many people lived in a limited amount of space. He believed, however, that the major blame for the health hazard lay with Mexican mothers who knew nothing about sanitation. Consequently, McLean urged a campaign of education. Yet, despite efforts by the city officials and private charities, La Pareta still noted a decade later that more Mexicans died of tuberculosis in 1 week than from any other cause. As McLean had observed, infant mortality among Mexicans was high during the period. In May 1910, out of 36 deaths in 1 week, 20 involved children less than 3 years of age. Almost all were Mexicans. Death seems to be a frequent and common visitor in the homes of the Mexican elements. The Times editorialized, but this is due not to any neglect or oversight upon the part of the city's health department, but solely to conditions which the department is unable to control. The paper believed that this condition arose from the unsanitary nature of the Chihuahua and urged the city to do something because the health department did not have sufficient resources. 4 years later, however, officials continued to report a high infant mortality rate in the barrios of 121 deaths during July. 52 children were under 5 years of age. As a result, the Times stated that health officers were employing every means possible to protect babies during the hot summer. Typhoid fever constituted an additional hazard in Mexican neighborhoods. In 1906, W.H. Anderson, El Paso's health director, told the city council that after an investigation he had discovered evidence of typhoid fever. According to Anderson, the causes for the disease lay in the unsanitary condition of certain areas. I wish to emphasize, the health inspector stressed, there is not a milk dairy within the city limits that is in unsanitary condition. He had also observed unsanitary water reservoirs, in addition to streets, alleys, and vacant lots filled with pools of stagnant water in the southern portion of the city. Moreover, condemned meat, fowl, and other garbage that had been deposited in the city dumping ground was being gathered by hungry people and hauled back to the city. In all, Anderson recorded 112 cases of typhoid fever in the city and called for an adequate force of sanitary inspectors. Although the city council accepted Anderson's recommendations and hired more health inspectors, 10 years later, with a heavier influx of Mexican immigrants and refugees, El Paso again became alarmed due to typhoid fever cases in the southern neighborhoods. To contain the disease in Chihuahua, health officers took various precautions. The Herald reported kerosene and vinegar baths were ordered for all who had been exposed in the tenement houses and in the neighborhood. Their heads were clipped and shaved, their clothing destroyed, and the houses thoroughly disinfected. 1 year later, under the continued threat of a typhoid fever epidemic, inspectors urged the city to construct public baths for the Mexicans. Quote, of vital importance now, stressed Dr. T.C. Galloway of the U.S. Public Health Services, is the providing of bathing and laundry facilities for the 20,000 of the El Paso's inhabitants who were without them. For the average American to live in health and decency without them. For the average American to live in health and decency. Oh, I'm sorry, I reread that twice. Decency without a. So sorry, this happens sometimes. Without a chance to keep himself and his clothes clean is almost inconceivable. Yet probably 2/5 of our population live under conditions which approach this. Galloway also informed that recent investigation indicated that in certain tenements, 20% of the occupants were louse infested. Because of these disclosures, the city built at least one public bath at Beale School. According to longtime El Paso resident Jose Cruz Burciaga, officials also operated public baths close to the international bridge linking El Paso to Ciudad Juarez. As an added precaution, the school board passed a motion that no children from across the border could attend El Paso public schools, and that city health physicians should be notified of any such children already in attendance. Finally, influenza caused much suffering among Mexicans. In October 1918, the worldwide Spanish flu epidemic hit El Paso. In order to quarantine the sickness, city officials closed all schools, theaters, churches, and public meeting halls. In addition, the army restricted all soldiers from the barrios as undertakers in the Mexican district reported in one day 18 deaths from influenza. 2 days later, 37 Mexicans died of the flu during the 24-hour period. On the other hand, conditions throughout the rest of the city improved rapidly and no deaths occurred. Charity workers in the south side that stated that the situation there had been worse than disclosed. For example, 22 sick people were discovered in one room. Although the associated charities of the city sent some volunteers into the Chihuahua, the lack of doctors and nurses who could speak Spanish hampered its effort. Because of this absence of any hospital in the vicinity, Oy School had to be converted into a temporary one. Nevertheless, the coroner's office indicated that many Mexicans who had died had not been treated by a physician. The epidemic ended, but its devastation exposed the deplorable scarcity of health services for Mexicans. While inadequate housing and the epidemics reflected the Mexicans' poverty as well as the economic exploitation directed at them. Crime in the barrios also appeared as a symptom of this relationship. Crimes committed by Mexicans in El Paso involved people who, in many cases, lacked basic necessities such as food or clothing. Moreover, it does not appear that they saw such crime directly, mainly at Americans or American-owned stores, with the same disapproval as did Americans. The most common charges brought against Mexicans were burglary, theft, and vagrancy. In 1904, for example, the Times reported the arrest of a Mexican woman for shoplifting at Kalisher's store. The evil of shoplifting, the people observed, is growing by leaps and bounds in El Paso. Although officials arrested shoplifters every week, similar incidents continued. Mexican women represented the majority of the violators, but the Times also said that one or two Mexican men have been arrested within the past week for this offense. Crime among Mexicans conveyed a sense of frustration and despair due to unfilled hopes. Such feelings often led to violence and indicated by charges consisting of disturbing the peace, assault, rape, and murder. Although Americans, especially the poor, committed similar crimes, it does not seem that such acts became as widespread in the more prosperous North Side neighborhoods. Paul Taylor, in his 1930s report on crime among Mexican and Chicago, discovered identical conditions. Taylor noticed that disorderly conduct represented 67.3% of all misdemeanors because of the language and cultural differences. Mexicans had less chance of properly defend themselves when arrested. Few Mexican lawyers practice in El Paso, and the court seldom selected Mexican jurists for service. A reporter who surveyed county jail conditions in 1900 wrote that Mexicans were are more inclined to plead guilty and throw themselves on the mercy of the courts than the Americans. The Americans usually arrange to fight their cases. Although no organized crime operated in El Paso, except for occasional street gangs by 1919, some residents of the Mexican settlements participated in, quote, dope rings. In order to make more money that year, for example, officers arrested Manuel Morales for the illegal sale of opium. According to the police, Morales owned a corral in Chihuahua and belonged to a ring that worked both sides of the border. Smuggling and selling narcotics, however, proved exceptional crimes in that most charges against Mexicans comprised lesser felonies and misdemeanors. Unfortunately, criminal activity in the Mexican quarters led at times to violations of residents' legal rights. In September 1918, 20 patrolmen and plainclothes, assisted by 18 other officers, swept the city south of the downtown area in search of gunmen and bootleggers. The police claimed that the raid resulted from numerous holdups in Chihuahua, and after the operation, they reported a number of important arrests, in addition to confiscating guns, knives, and liquor. Moreover, the police held the Mexicans on felony charges especially for carrying concealed weapons. As part of their search tactics, officers stopped practically every person they saw on the streets and searched them for guns and liquor. The chief of police also announced that similar raids would continue until all undesirable characters had been locked up or driven from the city. Finally, a strict 9 p.m. curfew would be enforced. Although police conducted no searches in the American districts, the chief added that precautions would be applied in these neighborhoods as well. This is the end of chapter 7, part 1. I know there's only a few pages left, but I will continue chapter 2. Chapter 7, part 2. Thank you.